On the morning of December 8, 1941, the line outside the nearest Army recruiting office stretched around the block before the doors even opened. Across the street, a woman turned off her kitchen radio, set down her coffee, and started thinking about the factory job she'd seen advertised in the paper. 2 blocks away, a shopkeeper opened his register, counted what was left, and wondered how much longer any of this would look the same. It wouldn't look the same for long. Within weeks, a country of 131 million people had begun to rearrange everything: their kitchens, their savings, their working hours, their wardrobes, and in thousands of cases, their sense of who they were. This is the story of what they gave and what it cost them. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft swept over Pearl Harbor, killing 2,400 Americans and pulling the United States into the largest war in human history. Recruiting offices across the country were overwhelmed within hours. Men queued around city blocks, some waiting through the night. Over the course of the war, more than 16 million Americans would serve in uniform, but the soldiers were not the only ones who went to war. The government had already started rationing tires in December 1941, within days of Pearl Harbor. Within months, the Office of Price Administration had created 8,000 local rationing boards, staffed by more than 30,000 volunteers. Ration books went out to every man, woman, and child in the United States, even infants. Each book contained stamps. Without the right stamps, there was no sugar, no butter, no coffee, no meat, no gasoline. Families received just 48 blue and 64 red points per month for processed and rationed food. Most drivers were limited to 3 gallons of gasoline per week. In January 1943, the government briefly banned the sale of sliced bread to conserve the wax paper used to wrap it. In restaurants across the country, notes appeared on menus. British journalist Alistair Cook, traveling through West Virginia in 1941, reported stopping for breakfast and finding a card on his table requesting customers, in the interests of national defense, keep to 1 cup of coffee. By the time the war was in full swing, nearly every item Americans ate, wore, used, or lived in was either rationed or regulated. New cars vanished entirely from dealerships. Home appliances like refrigerators and washing machines fell out of production, and for a generation still recovering from the Great Depression, this was not a distant inconvenience. It was daily life. But Americans didn't just endure the shortages. They went looking for ways to fill them. Japan's conquests across Southeast Asia had cut off nearly all of America's natural rubber supply. In June 1942, President Roosevelt launched a national rubber drive, urging every American to turn in, quote, old tires, old rubber raincoats, old garden hoses, rubber shoes, bathing caps, and gloves. The country responded with 450,000 tons of scrap rubber, collected in just 2 weeks. In October 1942, the War Production Board launched a national scrap metal drive with a target of 17 million tons. Communities tore down wrought iron fences. Families stripped bumpers off their own cars. Housewives donated pots and pans. Children sacrificed metal toys. The October drive ultimately brought in nearly 82 pounds of scrap per American. Nationwide, approximately 30 million children alone contributed 1.5 million tons of metal. Women surrendered nylon and silk stockings. The silk went into artillery powder bags. The nylon was recycled into parachutes. Each parachute required 36 pairs. By the end of September 1943, Americans had handed over 46 million pairs of hosiery for the war effort. The factories couldn't slow down for a single shift. In early 1942, the Bureau of Labor Statistics warned that unless action was taken immediately, a shortage of 6 million workers would halt American production within a year. The answer was women. In December 1941, roughly 13 million American women held jobs. By 1944, that number had climbed to more than 18 million. 6 million new workers who had never punched a factory clock before the war. In the U.S. aircraft industry alone, more than 310,000 women were employed by 1943, making up 65% of the industry's total workforce. Before the war, women had held barely 1% of those positions. They were machinists and welders, riveters and assemblers. They drove trucks, worked on farms, and built bombers. At Douglas Aircraft, 22,000 women went to work building heavy aircraft for the Army Air Forces. Nearly 350,000 American women also served in uniform. In the Women's Army Corps, the Navy's Waves, the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, and as Women's Air Force service pilots. The image that came to represent all of them wore a red and white bandana and looked directly at the viewer with steady, unblinking eyes. Rosie the Riveter. She had first appeared on a wartime poster in 1942, the creation of Pittsburgh artist J. Howard Miller. The following year, Norman Rockwell painted his own version for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. A woman in coveralls, rivet gun across her lap, her boot resting firmly on a copy of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. Her image spread everywhere. She represented something that had never existed in America before, the idea that the whole country, not just its soldier, was at war. Alongside their labor and their scrap rubber and their ration books, Americans put in their savings. The Treasury Department conducted 8 war bond drives between 1942 and 1946, each one calling on ordinary citizens to invest in the war. Bond rallies became national events. Hollywood stars traveled the country, auctioning everything from Betty Grable's stockings to Jack Benny's violin for pledges. At the UCLA-USC football game in December 1942, a student-run bond drive raised $2 million at the gate. On September 21, 1943, singer Kate Smith broadcast a 16-hour radio marathon on CBS as part of the Third War Loan Drive. She was already famous for her moving rendition of God Bless America. By the time the last hour ended, she had raised nearly $40 million in a single day. When all 8 drives were finished, 85 million Americans, more than half the entire population, had purchased $185 billion worth of bonds. For many families, that sum represented more than a year's wages. In backyards and vacant lots, on rooftops and window ledges, Americans planted. By 1945, 20 million victory gardens had taken root across the country. Together, they produced 40% of all the vegetables consumed in the United States that year. What had once been a lawn became a food source. What had once been a flower box became a row of beans. On November 13, 1942, USS Juno was struck by a Japanese torpedo during the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The torpedo hit the ship's ammunition magazines. The Juno blew apart and sank in 42 seconds. Of the 687 sailors aboard, only 10 survived. 4 of the Sullivan brothers died instantly in the explosion. The 5th, George, the oldest, 27 years old, made it onto a life raft. He survived for 5 days before slipping into the water and disappearing. The notification reached Waterloo on January 12, 1943. 3 officers. A front walk on Adam Street. Thomas Sullivan was standing in the yard, watching them approach. Their only surviving sibling, their sister Genevieve, later enlisted in the waves. They had all done what they came to do, and when one door of sacrifice closed, another opened. The numbers alone are staggering. 16 million Americans in uniform, 85 million war bond buyers, 20 million victory gardens, 46 million pairs of donated stockings. A country that had been pulling itself out of the Great Depression just years before, and that now built 2/3 of all Allied equipment, 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 193,000 artillery pieces and traumas, and fed armies on 2 sides of the globe. But the real weight of it lives somewhere smaller than the statistics. In the coffee, a woman didn't finish. In the pot handed through a car window to be melted down. In the blue star, in a window that quietly became gold. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the American home front had not just supported the war. In ways that no government order could have manufactured, it had fought it. In kitchens and factory floors and church collection drives and late-night radio marathons, one small sacrifice at a time. They used it up, they wore it out, and when there was nothing left, they found something else to give.